Every town has a dark side. In mid-2008, Vlado Taneski, a 56-year-old divorced journalist and father of two, was one of the most prominent and well-known figures in Kisovo, a small town in North Macedonia. Taneski was a diligent reporter who had gained some notoriety for his investigative talents in the world of true crime. Because for the past few years, the police in the area had been tracking a serial killer, an elusive predator who had taken the lives of several women in violent fashion. And Vlado seemed to have an uncanny knack for covering these cases, bringing to light information that almost nobody knew about. And so, how could that be? Hey guys, it's Andrew. Thanks for tuning into this episode of Every Town, where today we're going to check out the story of a man who turned into a monster. This one is a crazy tale. The question is, did he do this out of a compulsion that he just couldn't understand? Or did he actually do it all for clout? Let's head on over to Macedonia now and check out the serial killer known as the Kisovo Monster. After beginning his career at a radio station, by the 1980s, Vlado Taneski had been hired as a freelance reporter and columnist for several of the country's most circulated newspapers. And there, he did pretty decent for himself. And not only did he have a job that he was passionate about, but he was also happily married and the father of two children. And those who knew him saw him as a good man who always put his family first. And so much so that nobody could have guessed that he himself had come from a terribly broken home. Taneski was the second of three children, born in 1952 to Traje and Gorica, a deeply conservative and strict couple. His father, Traje, a former World War II vet, was an extremely tough, serious, and bad-tempered man who didn't hesitate to use his belt to enforce discipline at home. But interestingly, the real problem in the household was actually Vlado's mother. It's a generalization, but most can agree that moms tend to be more lenient and forgiving with their children than fathers. But Gorica was a special exception to the rule. And the woman, who worked as a hospital cleaner, was just as strict and harsh as her husband, and sometimes even more so. She was especially cruel to her son, whom she insulted, shouted at, and smacked around. The violence Gorica inflicted on him was so intense that Vlado ended up having nightmares and panic attacks at night. As he grew up, he began to describe his mom as an evil woman. Now, if you know anything about true crime, then you're aware that the children who grow up to be killers, well, often they have tumultuous upbringings. And when the mom is the prime tormentor, well, it usually leads to some very dark thoughts and behaviors from their kids. Despite the constant psychological and physical mistreatment he endured, Vlado tried his best to move forward. He stuffed those bad feelings as deep down as he could and looked to break that cycle. Starting a new life is how he looked at it, one that, with any luck, would be better than the one that had defined his early years. As a young adult, he saw education as his way out. He left his parents' house and moved to Croatia, where he began studying journalism, and in 1973, at the age of 21, he met the woman who would become his wife. And she was a law student named Vesna, who he had met at a poetry recital. They eventually married after completing their respective studies, and although everything was going well and Vlado had everything they needed to start over, he got pulled back in when he and his wife decided to return to Kisovo to care for his aging parents. And Vesna knew that her husband had never had a good relationship with them, but fate had made Vlado the only one with the means and willingness to help them. His wife even said that Vlado was a good husband, son, and father, and that he would have sacrificed himself for his family. However, this didn't mean that the man didn't have many unresolved issues with his folks. But Vlado thought that work could keep those demons at bay, that if he just stayed focused, he could just put them off into the background of his mind. It was during this new chapter that Taneski began working for those newspapers, and he wanted to be the best writer the country had ever known. In his world, where competition among writers was fierce, he was willing to do anything to get ahead, as in his mind, the ends justified the means. Because of that, on more than one occasion, young Vlado resorted to plagiarizing articles, even presenting his colleagues' work as his own. And it wasn't a good look and set his career back a few steps, and so for some time, he just sort of coasted through life, actually like a lot of people do. His career was flatlined, but he was working, so it wasn't all that bad. He struggled with being around his parents and the pressures of fatherhood and being the breadwinner. By the time he was 50 years old in 2002, he was looking at a life unfulfilled, potential that he saw in himself that had been wasted for a variety of reasons. Though that year something happened that was tragic. In a weird way, it might have been freeing for Vlado in a way only certain people can understand. His dad had had enough of this life and decided to unalive himself, and so that's what he did. Vlado's mother, after all the years of torment she put her son through, and after he spent a good chunk of his life still caring for her, blamed her son for what had happened to her husband. The arguments between mother and son became more frequent after that, to the point where his wife, who had once described him as a kind, affectionate, and very tender lover, said that the only time you could hear Vlado raise his voice was when he was arguing with his mom. And their relationship became so strained that it affected his marriage. And then, just a few months after his father passed, Gorka died in 2003 due to an accidental overdose of prescription meds. Now, of course, looking back, there's a lot of speculation surrounding her death. Was it actually accidental? Did she do it on purpose, or was her own son possibly involved, looking to end the arguments once and for all? The answers to those questions we'll never know for sure. But the good times didn't end there, because within the year, Vlado would go on to lose his job as a reporter due to downsizing and began to experience serious financial difficulties. The challenges kept piling up. By early 2004, less than a year after his mother's death, Vlado's once happy marriage had come to an end. His wife moved to the country's capital with their children after she received a promotion for work, but not Vlado, who, although he knew his work as a freelance crime journalist wouldn't bring him much money, decided to stay in his hometown to try and start over once again. And this time, he was going to make sure he got exactly what he wanted. In the early 2000s, the municipality of Kisovo was one of the safest, and to some extent, most boring places you could find in Europe at the time. In this place full of vast meadows, red roofs, and an industry that some media described as frozen in time, nothing strange really ever happened. Vlado spent his days and nights secluded in a small hut on the rural outskirts of town. He didn't socialize much, and his main companions were his telephone, a typewriter, and occasionally a computer. Isolated and working as a crime journalist in a small town where no real crime ever happens is tough. And Vlado decided to spice things up a bit, and that's exactly when the Kisovo Monster, as the media dubbed it, showed up. On November 16th of 2004, a 64-year-old woman named Mitra Simjanovsky suddenly disappeared. She'd last been seen at her home, and so when investigators arrived there for a welfare check, the only trace they found of her was a conspicuous trail of blood. Mitra's disappearance caught the attention of the small community, but it wasn't until January 12th of 2005, 2 months after her disappearance, that the case really went viral.
The older woman was found. She was naked. She was tortured before she died, before she was killed.
A cleaner happened upon her naked body disposed of in a plastic bag at a Kissabo garbage dump. There were clear signs that she had been tied up, tortured, assaulted, and finally strangled. But even more horrifying was the fact that Mitra had only been dead for 2 weeks, proving that her killer, whoever it was, had held her captive for at least 40 days. The news spread, and soon scores of journalists from all around arrived at the scene to cover the breaking story. Among them was Taneski. A murder of this nature was something new for the town, and Vlado, who seemed particularly interested in the case, stood to jumpstart his writing career off it. He set out to interview some of the victims' family and friends, talk to them about what had happened. And a big part of his motivation here wasn't just to get the inside scoop. It was to understand the progress of the investigation as a whole for his own personal reasons. The article Taneski published about the killing caught the attention of many, as he provided incredibly detailed and thorough information on the case. His notes gave specific details about the interior of Mitra's apartment. He even claimed that the woman's body was dragged into the kitchen after her attacker surprised her. Most of Taneski's colleagues dismissed these claims as mere speculation, but investigators weren't so sure. The police quickly noticed that all the details Vlado gave in his article matched their findings, which was odd since he didn't have access to that information. Still though, none of these irregularities were enough to raise suspicions about his participation in the crime, at least not for now. In the end, the investigation pointed to 28-year-old Ante Risteski and his friend Igor Merseski as the prime suspects. Because weeks before Mitra's disappearance, the two men had robbed and murdered an elderly man during a burglary in a nearby town. After their arrest, the men did confess to killing the man but denied any involvement in Mitra's murder. Nevertheless, after their trial, Risteski and Merseski were sentenced to life in prison, even though semen found on the victim's body didn't match either of them. Case closed. But then 3 years later, in early November of 2007, a 56-year-old woman named Lubitsa Lakoska went shopping after finishing her shift as a cleaner, although she never returned home. And just like 3 years ago, Lubitsa's disappearance caused a stir in town, and just like before, Vlado took it upon himself to investigate the case. Almost 3 months after her disappearance, on February 3rd of 2008, the woman's body was found by a garbage collector in circumstances eerily similar to the crime 3 years earlier. The body was discovered in a plastic bag in a wooded area near a gas station in Kissabo. As in the case of Mitra, the autopsy revealed that the woman had been tied up, tortured, assaulted, and strangled. Moreover, all indications were that the victim had been held captive for several days before her attacker finally decided to kill her. Vlado followed the case closely, of course, and in the days that followed, the reporter published numerous articles in which he speculated in great detail about how the woman's kidnapping might have been carried out. Taneski mentioned an open window, a lit lamp, a surprise attack in which the victim fought back, and even a stab wound to the chest. This detailed account was once again considered speculation, though. Yes, it raised a few eyebrows among law enforcement, but it sounded like someone just trying to create a story for attention. After all, why would a killer release details like this, and more importantly, how could they be proven? Most detectives thought that the meticulous details Taneski wrote of were simply a mixture of coincidence and police leaks. The investigation indicated that the murders of Mitra and Lubitsa were related, which was a problem considering the two suspects in Mitra's case were supposedly in jail. But there were just too many similarities between the two cases to dismiss the idea that maybe they got the wrong guys. And not only were the actual killings similar, but also the women themselves. Both older and both cleaning ladies. It would only take a couple more months for a third body to appear, and this was the one that would crack the whole case wide open finally. On May 16th of 2008, the body of 65-year-old Zavana Temilkoska was found by a passerby in a plastic bag and on a pile of garbage next to the local soccer field in Kisovo. The autopsy revealed that the woman, who had disappeared 9 days earlier, had not only been murdered in similar circumstances to the two previous victims, but that this time the level of violence inflicted by the monster of Kisovo had escalated. Zavana had not only been tied up and assaulted, the killer had unleashed a rage on the woman. Her body had 3 cranial wounds and several broken ribs. And 2 days later, as investigators began to connect the dots linking the victims, Vlado called his editor and explained his hypothesis regarding this latest murder. Under the headline, "Serial Killer Haunts Kisovo," in the article published on May 19th of 2008, the following words could be read. "The people of Kisovo are living in fear after another murdered body was found in town. The body bears a striking resemblance to one discovered 20 kilometers from Kisovo last year, and there is a possibility that these monstrous murders are the work of a serial killer." From there, he goes on to connect the dots between the 3 victims. The women were of similar ages, worked as cleaners, and all lived alone. What he didn't include, though, was that all these women knew one another, and most importantly, were friends or acquaintances with his own mother, who, if you remember, was also a cleaner. Around this time, investigators were creating a profile on this killer. They came to the conclusion that the suspect was a mature man of strong build and above average intelligence. He was a person who lived in the same area where the crimes took place, likely knew the victims, and had developed deep sadomasochistic desires in his childhood. With more and more clues and more suspicions, the police then decided to set a trap for the terrible monster of Kisovo. One of the interesting similarities between the victims was that all the women had been strangled with the same weapon, a telephone cord. And this detail was clear to the investigators, and since Vlado's articles were overly meticulous about the nature of the crimes, they were especially careful to keep this piece of evidence secret. Vlado had achieved some good success as a reporter thanks to his articles. In some of them, he claimed that one of the victims had been deceived by the killer when he told her that her son was injured, taking advantage of her moment of weakness to kidnap her. On another occasion, he described one of the women as wearing a solid gold crucifix around her neck, stating that the brightness of her blue eyes was extinguished by the shroud of death. In another report, he wrote the following words: "The motives of the Kisovo monster are still unclear. Both women were friends, Mitra and Zavana, and lived in the same part of town. The police have some suspects they are interrogating." For reasons unknown, Vlado decided to stir the pot a bit and attack the police from there, harshly criticizing them for alleged irregularities in the investigation and for implicating the wrong men, referring to the cases of Risteski and Merceski, who were arrested and convicted for the death of the first victim. Vlado just couldn't help himself as he regurgitated all his knowledge of the crimes, and the police were counting on it. Eventually, his biggest mistake amongst his articles was that he revealed the model of the telephone cord the killer used to strangle his victims. That, plus he mentioned the exact positions of the bodies, the fact that this cord had been left at the crime scene. So all this information had been deliberately kept secret, yet Vlado was aware of it. The Kisovo monster had taken the bait, and at this point, the investigators were almost certain that Taneski was the killer. However, they still needed conclusive evidence. Forensics determined that some of the blood found near the last victim did not belong to her, and instead her attacker. So from there, it was just a matter of time. The investigators then sifted through a long list of suspects, and after questioning 150 men with the same blood type, most were eliminated, except for several neighbors, taxi driver, and Vlado. Soon after that, DNA samples were taken to compare with other semen samples. The results were irrefutable. The serial killer terrorizing Kisovo was none other than the journalist who wrote in detail about all the cases. And so on June 20th of 2008, Taneski was charged with the crimes, and even as the investigation progressed and a growing mountain of evidence poured over his head, well, he never stopped maintaining his innocence. 7 of his hairs were found next to the remains of the first victim. A robe that belonged to his mother was found in the same bag as Ivana's body. And when police searched his home, they found shoelaces and rope that matched those used on the victims, as well as some of the women's belongings and sadomasochistic material. The discovery shocked both those who knew Vlado, or had read any of his articles, his ex-wife, acquaintances, his colleagues and editors, but nobody saw this one coming from him. Even more messed up was the fact that the 3 women shared characteristics such as age, social status, and even the type of work they did with his own mother, suggesting that deep in his mind, Vlado had committed these offenses as a kind of indirect revenge against his mom, towards whom he had generated so much fear and hatred over the years. It's also very possible that he never even realized it. I will never know for sure, though, what went through his mind and his true motivations. 3 days after his arrest, Taneski was found dead in his cell at Tetovo prison.
He put his head into a bucket of water just in the corner and drowned himself in it. His cellmates have found the body with the head in the water and the hands out of the bucket.
Authorities claimed that he had done this to himself, though what they didn't know was how none of the inmates or guards noticed what was going on. Investigators had hoped that Taneski's testimony would help them discover the whereabouts of Gorka Pavleska, a 78-year-old woman who disappeared in 2003. While she has never been found, she was a retired cleaner who they believe was likely the killer's first victim. Interestingly, she shared the same name as Vlado's mother. So that's it for this week's episode of Everytown. Hope you all enjoyed it, and thanks for tuning in. Remember to come back next week for another episode filled with scary, strange, and mysterious stories, because you never know. Maybe your town will be next.